A very good afternoon, Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman ISAS NUS, Professor C. Raja Mohan, Director ISAS, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, Catherine Dusat Miller, Distinguished Service Professor of Finance, University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and former Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jia Hao, and I have the pleasure of being your MC for today. On behalf of ISAS NUS, I welcome you to this afternoon's 6th ISAS lecture titled The Third Pillar, How Markets and the State Leave the Community Behind. To start off the proceedings, I would like to invite Professor Raja Mohan, Director ISAS, to deliver the opening remarks. Professor Mohan, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you for this afternoon's 6th ISAS lecture. I know you turned in large numbers, not to listen to me, but to Dr. Rajan, who is here, so I won't be long. So I want to just make 3 sets of points at this stage. One, I will say how delighted we are to have Dr. Raghuram Rajan with us this afternoon, especially to talk about his new book that is just out. We've been trying to get Dr. Rajan for a while, and our chairman, Mr. Pillai, has been very eager to have him with us in one of our other events, but we're lucky that we managed to work this out, and we're really grateful for him to find time from his busy schedule to be here with us and to discuss his book with all of us this afternoon. I also want to thank James Crabtree, an old friend from Bombay, who's here. He's a colleague at the National University of Singapore, for agreeing to join us this afternoon and to moderate the discussion. Therefore, it's really welcome, James, and therefore I'm not even pretending to introduce Dr. Rajan or his subject, so James will do quite a bit of that. Second, I think I want to say a word about the ISAS. We are almost 15 years old. We've been here since 2004, 2005. We're trying to, the mandate of ISAS is to study contemporary South Asia on economic, political, social, and security dynamics that is shaping the subcontinent. We look forward to more of your support. We're trying to connect with other research institutions in the city, in the NUS, with other universities like the National Nanyang Technological University, and even more broadly to the larger community in the city. So as South Asia becomes important, we believe ISAS, based in the NUS system, can actually become a hub for global engagement on issues relating to South Asia, how the world is looking at South Asia, as well as how South Asia is responding to the rest of the world. So I believe that this dynamic interaction is an important one, and the Institute for South Asian Studies here is well positioned to be able to shape and promote that conversation, and that's one of the reasons why we're so happy to have Dr. Rajan with all of us here. Finally, a word about the topic of the book. Now, as all of you know, that we're in a difficult economic situation at the global level, and it's quite easy to blame the populists for what's going on. But Dr. Rajan has a record, of course, says we need to save capitalism not only from populists, but also from the greedy capitalists. In fact, one of his earlier books was titled Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists, that actually you have a real complex situation where the traditional belief that economic policy is about a dynamic engagement between the market and the state, and that in this presumption we've tended to neglect the third pillar, which is what the title of the book, the society, the community. That in the end, societies or communities are not just organisms meant to promote economic efficiency. They're also social beings. They have a life of their own, and that those capitalists or those societies, those economies that neglect the social dimension of modern capitalism will face problems, and we've seen, and when those people are mobilized, as we've seen happen in the United States, the consequences for the rest of the world are going to be, as we've already seen, are quite significant. So the argument Dr. Rajan is making on the third pillar, on the need to integrate the society into this equation between market and the state is an important one. It's a timely one, and it is one that I think the rest of the world is going to be quite engaged. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Raghuram Rajan and Dr. Vinay.
All right, welcome everybody. Thank you very much, Raja. Thank you, Ambassador Pillai. Thank you all for coming at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It's nice to see such a large crowd, and thank you in particular to Dr. Rajan for making some time out of his schedule in a quite brief trip to Singapore. The order of play is Dr. Rajan is going to speak for about half an hour and give you a sense of the argument of the book. I have my well-thumbed copy here, and you should all be thinking about buying your own. Then I'll ask him a few easy questions to get things going, and then we'll open up to you so you can ask him some harder questions. And then we'll wrap up at about 20 past 4, maybe half past 4, depending on how things are going. I mean, I thought Raja gave a very good introduction to the book. What I guess I would say is that this book is, I think, even more interesting than the 2 previous books that Dr. Rajan has written because of its breadth. So some academic economists become policymakers, as Dr. Rajan was at the RBI and the IMF. Some policymakers become academics, but not very many manage to make the transition to being a genuine public intellectual in which you are grappling with the breadth of the most difficult issues that face us at a particular moment in time, and that bring a real breadth of scholarship. And more so even than Fault Lines, the book about the financial crisis, or the book that Raja mentioned, this one covers almost the entirety of human history, going back to antiquity through the rise of the nation state in Tudor England and in the 19th century around the Industrial Revolution, right up to concerns, contemporary concerns about the rise of big tech, growing populism, consolidation of power in financial markets and in other sorts of markets, and both looking at that in the rich world but also in the emerging world here in Asia. And so it's a book of very big ideas, and I'm looking forward to hearing the presentation on the book for the first time. So give a warm round of applause to Dr. Rajan to Singapore.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you very much, Professor Raja Mohan, for inviting me here. And thanks to all of you for coming on a Thursday afternoon. So, I mean, authors always have to explain why they wrote a book. And my reason for writing it is total confusion. Why was the capitalist system breaking down? I went to India, was governor of the Reserve Bank. As I, watched from India, it seemed to me a whole set of forces had been unleashed. This is even before the advent of Donald Trump, but it is after Brexit. And trying to figure out what was going on, why was the global system that worked so well for 60 years after World War II, why was it breaking down? We used to have this platitude every time we ended a G20 meeting that we'll all sort of work towards improving global trade and maintaining open borders and this and that. And we never thought anybody would actually question that. And most recently, of course, we've had the US refusing to sign off on that platitude. In fact, questioning whether, in fact, open borders were a good thing. So this was a attempt to make sense of the world and ask what was going wrong. In my earlier book, Fault Lines, I tried to relate some of what happened during the global financial crisis to an urgent need to make people whose incomes were falling behind happier. And the answer I felt at that time was easy credit, but it didn't work. We had the global financial crisis as a result. This book stemmed from trying to look deeper. What's really been going on? And do we have experience with this kind of thing in the world before? And that's where I sort of ventured way beyond my traditional areas of research and expertise, which is really financial markets, monetary policy, corporate finance, but into areas of history, sociology, etc., to try and develop a broader picture of what the capitalist system really had become post-World War II and why it was being threatened once again. And to some extent, and often this is the hardest part of the book, what we need to do to get back on track. So that's where we're going in the space of the next half hour. And let me start by talking about the standard view of capitalism, right? And that's really about free and competitive markets. And if you're at the University of Chicago, that's all you need. If you're elsewhere, you need a government which, certainly to enforce contracts and property rights that the university believes in, but also to do sometimes more, to perhaps manage safety nets and so on. But what this neglects, as Raja pointed out, was the third pillar. Now, broadly speaking, the markets we all understand, labor markets, financial markets. I did something here which is probably, what did I do? Sorry, okay. Labor markets, financial markets, and goods markets, etc., that we understand. By the government, I mean the political structure, and I include broadly speaking the central government, the judiciary, the legislature, basically the big apparatus of the state. I don't include local government. By the third pillar, I mean, for the most part in this book, the local community. The people around you, your neighbors, the local government, the municipality, as well as all the organizations inside. And through history, I argued that the community has been extremely important. In fact, before markets came, before the state as we know it came, the tribe was essentially the be-all and end-all of all our interactions, whether economic interactions, political interactions, or social interactions. But then we moved beyond the tribe. We got to broader markets. We got to a bigger state, a nation state. But even then, the local community was very important. And at least two places where it still is very important today, providing what I call pre-market support. Study after study shows early childhood experiences are extremely important in giving you values, in giving you basic education, in giving you basic nutrition, and that essentially sets you for life. In fact, my colleague Jim Heckman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, says beyond 5 you're irreparable. All the damage has been done. Now, that's a little extreme, but early childhood matters tremendously in your life outcomes. But beyond that, the community also offers us safety nets. In the global financial crisis, as it dragged on, as the recovery was slow in coming, many people in Europe ran out of savings, ran out of their unemployment insurance. What do? They moved back into their community with friends and neighbors, with relatives, with parents, and stayed there until they were able to stand on their feet again. They had no formal contract, they had no formal claim, but there was the social claim, we are part of the same community, and therefore they got help. And this is something that everybody in Asia should understand. The family, the broader sort of clan, as well as your neighborhood, is extremely important still in many countries in offering support. And in the modern democracy, the community also becomes a building block for democratic organization and democratic reaction. So it's when these three pillars work together in creating a tolerable capitalism, and capitalism has to be tolerable, then the many support capitalism. And I would argue that the post-war balance between the three pillars that was achieved in industrial countries essentially was a model that a lot of countries wanted to try and follow. The liberal market democracy, liberal in the sense of being open, constrained governments, not authoritarian governments, vibrant markets, as well as democratic structures which relied on the building block of communities. Now, this worked very well, and if you think about it, was one of the most important sources of prosperity that the world has ever seen. And many of our developing, of our emerging markets are trending towards this kind of structure, with perhaps the exception of China, and we'll come back to that maybe a little later. So how does this model work? This is sort of the model. There are no graphs, there are no numbers in the book, there are no formulas in the book, but this is sort of my model of how it works. So think of three pillars: state, markets, and community. And the blue lines are things that we understand and recognize. They're sort of out there in various literatures. The state, of course, provides regulation, antitrust, property rights, all that to the markets. It sort of governs the way markets develop. The state also provides security, justice, enhances capabilities, sometimes provides schooling for people, as also provides safety nets for the community. And finally, the last blue arrow, the blue arrows are the ones we understand. The markets offer productivity and choice to the community. What is less well appreciated are the green arrows, which I think are equally important. The markets provide a source of countervailing power to the state. Independent private sectors act as a constraint on the state. Now, if you don't believe that, look at the difference between many emerging markets where the private sector is basically dependent on the state and rarely serves as a constraining power. In a number of emerging markets, if the state says jump, the private sector asks how high, right? On the other hand, if you look at, for example, what's happening in the United States today, you see independent organizations like Bloomberg, the Washington Post, the New York Times, essentially going after the administration and trying to essentially keep it under check by highlighting instances of administrative actions that are improper. This is not true of many emerging markets, whether it's India, Turkey, Thailand, other countries. The private sector is much more under the thrall of the state. An independent comparative private sector often is a valuable device because of its independence. It's able to take a position. It doesn't owe the state that much. And when there are many independent players, many of them moderate to medium size, they can act as a constraint. Similarly, I think one of the biggest problems that Adam Smith talked about, in fact, The Wealth of Nations, is not really a treatise on the lines of Ayn Rand. Many people think that Adam Smith is a loony right-wing nut. When you read The Wealth of Nations, you understand that one of his biggest concerns was cronyism between the entrepreneurs and the state and between the entrepreneurs themselves. And he thought that was one of the biggest illnesses of capitalism. And one of the interesting points is that democracy, which wasn't prevalent that much in Adam Smith's time, is a big factor which prevents that kind of cronyism, because the individual sitting alone without the influence that the cronies have wants much more of a level playing field. Again and again, you see populist movements of the kind that we saw in the 19th century in the United States attempt to create a level playing field because they don't have the influence that the large corporations have. You see a similar movement in the United States. All the concerns about big tech, big banks, etc., is about the smaller guys saying, I have no influence in those areas of power, and I want a much more level playing field, a much more transparent playing field. The community through democracy is extremely important in ensuring that, and that ensures that you have competition which creates a much more independent private sector. So these things sort of fit together. The community helps the markets, and the markets help the community by keeping the system democratic. And finally, the community often is the source of values and norms for the markets. The markets don't get these independently. So for those who say, and many people in big anonymous cities living in large high-rises often say, I don't know my neighbor. What's this community you're talking about? Well, unfortunately, that is true. In many big cosmopolitan cities, we are becoming less and less in contact with our proximate neighbor. This is not true of most people, even in developed countries. 70% of people in the United Kingdom still identify with the village or town they grew up in, and 30% still live in the same town they were born in. So there is a lot more community, which may have prompted Theresa May to call many of the people in this room, including myself, citizens of nowhere, while in fact there are others who are much more tied to the community. But nevertheless, the community still matters. It's a basis for identity and values. But even in a modern economy like the United States, study after study shows where you grew up defines what you become. Raj Chetty has this paper which shows when people move, their parents move at an early age from a bad community to a good community. Good in the sense that children in that community get good jobs and wonderful careers. It turns out the number of years you spend in that good community defines how well you do in life later on. So community does matter. You have the same parents, both in the bad community and the good community. Parents, you're controlling for parents, but the community matters because you get much better preparation for life in the good community. And presumably this works because the community fills in the holes left by formal relationships. Formal relationships can be similar. In fact, that's the nature of government, that's the nature of markets across many areas. But it's a community which recognizes the individual need, fills that in, as I suggested with the example of what happened during the Great Recession. As I said, just repeating, the community offers you both preparation for the market, early childhood education, schooling, etc., but also a safety net, and helps in political organization. Now, this is not to dismiss other forms of community. We today sometimes have much greater interactions within the office than at home, some of us. So I want to allow for a variety of communities, but much of the emphasis in this book is on the proximate community, because I'll tell you that is what is going wrong. So what perturbs the balance? So something's going wrong. Something has changed. This balance that works so well in industrial countries, to the point that some people were proclaiming the ultimate victory of capitalism, including Francis Fukuyama, something's gone wrong. What has? Typically, what changes society dramatically is either great calamity. Many of you who know your history know the Black Death essentially was a big reason feudalism died. I talk about some of that in the book. But another big reason for change is technological change. And we've seen massive technological change in recent times. The information and communications technology revolution has changed society quite dramatically. I will talk about how it's changed each of the three pillars in the next three slides, and then try and give you a sense of what the problem is and how we solve it. So clearly the information communications technology revolution has changed markets. It's made trade much cheaper. With the advent of things like the container ship, it's easy to move goods back and forth across borders. Global supply chains have been created, and those supply chains can produce anywhere, anytime. Communications were very important in enabling that, because we now know what's happening to production in Thailand while sitting in Chicago, and we can adjust quite rapidly if there's a problem. Now, what this has done is it has hit manufacturing in industrial countries tremendously, because far cheaper to do the moderately skilled manufacturing in the emerging markets where the price of labor was low. This was the big transformation that happened over the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s. And it hollowed out the rural semi-urban areas in the industrial countries. You lost a lot of manufacturing jobs, which typically were in those smaller towns in these semi-urban areas. But on the other hand, while manufacturing has disappeared, services has become much more important in those countries. They're providing services not just for themselves, but for the globe. And therefore, service worker wages have gone up. Many of them congregate around the sort of urban hubs. And the kind of growth you've seen in cities like San Francisco, New York, has been tremendous. Much of the growth in industrial countries today is focused on a few big cities, not spread widely. So that's one. The geographic distribution of growth has changed significantly in these countries. Also, across the income spectrum, the unionized factory jobs were the middle income jobs. They have disappeared. So for the high school educated worker, there's very little except working in a warehouse for Amazon with a earpiece which tells you which bin to go to, what item to pick up, and to put in a package. Relatively low skilled jobs. That's one set of jobs that are available. And this has impacted not just the manufacturing worker, but it's also impacted a variety of services. Take the accountant, whose forte was to know every large detail of the tax code. That required a lot of learning, a lot of preparation. Today, a tax preparation software does that, cheaply. So that accountant is now out of a job. But a bunch of new jobs have been created. The high school grad who can use that software can now provide tax services to his or her grandparents who are less capable with the computer, but now can rely on this person for software services and to a variety of others. So you get organizations like in the US, H&R Block provides tax preparation software to everyone. Earlier, people couldn't hire an accountant. It was too expensive. Now you can hire that high school grad to provide that. A lot more jobs at the lower end. And that tax accountant who does customized sort of tax preparation for the very rich, creating shelters in Panama and shelters in Uruguay and so on, that tax accountant is also much better off because now they can access tax systems across the world. They don't need to know every code because software helps them. And so they make a ton of money because they are very creative, very specialized. And the guys at the bottom, a lot more jobs, but not much money. The middle is getting hollowed out true across the industrial world. It's worse than that because not only is there a missing middle in the income spectrum, the incomes at the very top are increasing tremendously, and this is the winner-take-all nature of the economy. Take a look at those two women there. Recognize any of them? The younger people in the crowd? The lady on the right? Taylor Swift. So that's pretty obvious. Lady on the left, her name is Elizabeth Billington. She was the star of the London Opera in 1801, right? The highest paid diva at that time, she made between 10 and 15,000 pounds a season, which in today's money is about $1 million. Taylor Swift made $170 million. 170 times, I'm adjusting for inflation, of course, 170 times what Elizabeth Billington made. Why are incomes of the divas of today so much higher than the incomes of divas of yesterday? Because Elizabeth Billington could only sing to the opera house. 1,000 people a session, maybe 100 a season, 100,000 people. Taylor Swift's latest song was downloaded over 3.5 billion times. Billion, right? So we're talking billions, we're talking 100,000. You see the difference in magnitude of reach. That's the winner-take-all economy. And I say Elizabeth Billington because the original superstar paper in economics was written by Sherwin Rosen with her in mind. We are getting incomes at the very top increasing even more. What the market has done is increase the returns to skills, even while creating geographic dispersion in jobs, as well as creating a dispersion of incomes. Now, if you want to move from the low-income job to the high-income job, you need to get the skills to make that jump. And typically, you also need to make a geographic movement from your neighborhood in the rural area to the urban cities. Now keep both these in mind as we talk further. The second thing that the ICT revolution has done is that it has changed the state. Earlier, the powers that used to be at the national level used to be very limited because a lot of activity happened locally within the community. Think, for example, when banks were located within towns and didn't expand beyond. Capital requirements for the banks were set at the town level. Then the banks expanded across the state. Capital requirements were set at the state level. Then banks became national. Capital requirements were set at the national level. Today, banks are international. Where are capital requirements set? In Basel, where the central bankers meet behind closed doors in a faraway country and set capital requirements for the globe. As the world has become more integrated, powers have moved up and up. This was always true with integrated national markets. You don't have emission requirements set by every county, you have emission requirements set by the nation because you don't want the car to be stopped at every local boundary. But a lot more has moved up. Take the European Union. One of the big complaints that some of those who want to exit, the Brexiteers, have is too much control has moved to Brussels. Too much is determined by Brussels relative to London. And in fact, too much is determined by London. They want much more to come down to their communities. Taking back control is one of the big mantras of the Brexiteers, but it's a broader point. Across the world, communities have become disempowered. Too much of education is determined at the center, too much of healthcare is determined at the center, too much of every policy is determined at the center in order to promote integrated markets within the country, and sometimes it's even disappeared to the international arena to promote international markets across countries. And finally, the community, and we've been talking about this already. Technological change has increased the importance of good schooling. That's the leap we talked about from those low-income jobs to the high-income jobs. But the community has weakened. It's weakened because communities have been differentially hit. Those urban areas are doing much better, the big cities, than the rural or semi-urban area. They've become disempowered. They don't have the ability to change their fate because education policy is not determined locally. They don't have local funding. And it is disintegrating because the combination of the first two means that if you're a parent with the means to move, why do you want to stay in this community where jobs have left, social disintegration is setting in, family breakdown is setting in, the local institutions are deteriorating in quality? You don't stay, you leave. And as you leave, as we get the secession of the successful, they go live where the successful live, typically in the big cities. They can afford it because they get good salaries. And what we get is certainly a meritocracy, but it's a hereditary meritocracy because only the children of the successful have a chance of succeeding. That's why the people in the left behind places feel really angry because they really don't have a hope of doing particularly well in this global economy. And the reason is the community itself, which surrounds them, is breaking down. It's unable to provide the right level of pre-market support in this case, as also because it's relatively impoverished, even the safety net it used to provide is much less active. So opportunity is becoming transparently unequal. Capitalism is all about not equalizing outcomes, but that you have an equal chance of reaching those wonderful outcomes. Today, that's no longer true across the industrial world. And as a result, you get widespread populist anger. People are blaming the elite, blaming the corrupt sort of policies from the center. These guys favor the immigrant, the minorities, but what about us? We're being left behind. And that's fertile ground for the populist nationalist to say, I feel your pain, your community is breaking down. Here's an alternative community, the national community. We're going to recover our glory. We're going to make America great again. We're going to make the UK great again. We're going to make India great again. And you will have this national community, whether it's majoritarian Hinduism or majoritarian white nationalism in Eastern Europe. But what this does, typically it is protectionist in nature. Typically, it's focusing on benefiting some groups at the expense of other groups. And it leaves us poorly positioned for a future where technological change is changing the nature of jobs. You cannot tell people by raising barriers you'll somehow recover the coal jobs that have left the United States. It's not going to come back. You have to prepare people for new jobs. And that requires working on creating opportunity where they live. And as populations age, the industrial countries need markets elsewhere. The rise of the rest means that having an open economy is going to be beneficial both for industrial countries as well as the rest of the world. That is becoming harder and harder as protectionist instincts set in. And this notion of dividing up the world is going to be really problematic when we have to deal with global problems which are already with us, like climate change. You need much more understanding between countries. Populist nationalism is not the answer. So what answer do I have? Broadly, the next 3 minutes, push power back. Certainly, if we want globalization of trade and services and so on, let's not globalize power. Let's not put power in these unelected structures. Let's have more power coming back to the national capital and from the national capital to local agencies. In fact, follow the principle of subsidiarity. It's a Catholic principle which says, let's push power down to the lowest level at which it can be exercised effectively. That's a good principle to follow. Now, at the international level, when you push power back to countries, that doesn't mean every country then says, I want to make myself great again. It means that you have to then behave with responsibility. So what I talk about is responsible sovereignty. Take powers back. Don't have international bodies determining what countries should do unless absolutely necessary. But then work with others to offer creative solutions to problems like climate change. It has to be more democratic, but it has to be cooperative, which is why I use the word responsible sovereignty. And furthermore, within countries, push power down to the locality for a more inclusive, for more localism, but don't make that localism irresponsible localism, exclusionary localism. Don't create segregated enclaves in every country of the rich and the poor. Instead, much more integrated neighborhoods, so inclusive localism. How do we achieve the community of the future? That's really the last sort of focus of the book. And what I argue is we have examples of countries that do this. For example, Switzerland has managed to create much more localism by pushing powers down from the federal government to the cantons and from the cantons further to the municipalities. The 26 cantons, 3,000 municipalities in a country of 8 million. And they manage it. So take, for example, education. The National Institutes of Technology are managed by the federal government. The high schools are managed by the cantons, while the primary schools are entirely the bailiwick of the municipality. And that ensures that each level has power over certain elements that they have most direct experience of, and that's a good thing. In the book, I talk about communities. So in this environment, let's push power down, but that's not going to be enough. We need communities to be able to pick themselves up. The communities that are ridden with social problems, ridden with crime. And one example I pick up of a community that's actually doing this is near my home in Chicago, the Pilsen community. In the late 1980s, it was a war zone, literally. 21 gangs were battling each other over 2 miles of their high street. The death rate approached the death rate on the Eastern Front in World War II in that community, so the death rate per 100,000. Eventually, when a body was found outside the local church, the pastor said, at what point are you going to stop treating this as somebody else's problem? When are we going to do something about this? A bunch of youth got together, formed what they call the Resurrection Project, and started working to rebuild the community. First thing they did was tackle crime. They pushed people to report criminal incidents when they happened. They got people to come out on the streets when the criminal incidents happened so as to crowd out further crime. They got businesses to offer jobs to gang members so that they had an alternative to violence as a means of livelihood. And over time, as the community got engaged, crime levels fell significantly. Part of what they did was petition the city authorities to close down the pubs where the criminal element congregated and essentially cleared them out of these local areas. So, variety of things they did, more details in the book, but this got the community engaged and brought down crime levels. I've already talked about more powers to act. One of the powers, for example, it would have been good for Pilsen to have is to decide which businesses do business in the neighborhood. If the pub is where all the criminal elements congregate, they should have the right to close those pubs down. They had to do it in this case by petitioning the city authorities rather than having the power themselves. A lot of communities would benefit tremendously from some small changes in infrastructure. If they, for example, had a nice access road to the highway, if they had a waterfront which was cleaned up, if Main Street was made much more business friendly, that could revive communities. So infrastructure is important. Across the world, we're desperately looking for investments. Infrastructure investment in these communities would be a good thing. The important thing, however, is it shouldn't be infrastructure decided from the center. It should be much more bottom-up choices of what kind of infrastructure is going to help the community. More broadly, what I'm focusing or emphasizing in this book is we need to move much more on the economic front towards place-based policies rather than generalized stimulus. We need policies which are relevant for particular places. And importantly, those policies have to come from people there who understand what is needed rather than from the center. One example of a central policy which didn't work, in the US you have this thing called opportunity zone, which sort of provides incentives and subsidies for firms to set up in depressed neighborhoods. Every country has something like that. What is the best kind of investment you could hope to attract? For many in the US, it is Amazon's second headquarters. Amazon promised to go to Long Island City with its second headquarters, bringing 25,000 jobs, paying $150,000 a piece. And Long Island City said, no, thank you. We don't want you. What's the problem? The problem is you haven't thought about what the community wants. The community was a lot poorer people than the kind of people who would get jobs at Amazon. And they were saying, we're not going to get any of those jobs. Instead, what we're going to see is a lot of outsiders coming in, taking those jobs, pushing up local rents, pushing up local property taxes. And what's going to be left for us? Yeah, maybe it increases local business revenues, but most of us are going to be pushed out. So no wonder the community didn't want that kind of investment. More broadly, we need bottom-up thinking on what kinds of investment makes sense. And it's true of depressed communities in India or depressed communities in the United States or France. They're all, I think, need help, and bottom-up would be good. Similarly, funding. Many of them need funding help. But funding to start the process, to start the process, because much of the process can become self-regenerating after that initial bout of funding. Once the community starts picking up, community assets go up in value. If the community owns those assets, they can be a source of additional funding down. So there are lots of aspects of community revival that are important to understand and perhaps replicate more widely. But I would start first by pushing more powers and funding to the community while ensuring that they have a greater ability to find the leadership locally. So more incentives for people to stay in depressed communities rather than leave them, and we can talk about them in the Q&A. And finally, when I talk about community, many people fear that I am recommending segregated communities of the past, some kind of system where the rich sort of have moats around them and the poor are kept out. Far from it. What I'm advocating is low walls around communities which build more of a sense of community belonging and structure and allow the community to prepare people for the markets much better than they do today. But I'm by no means advocating high segregated communities. What is going to keep the walls around a community low? The other two pillars, the state and the market. And by enforcing the laws of the land, by ensuring that the market can leap across the borders of a community, you make the community continue to be inclusive while you get some of the benefits of community. Is this a contradiction? No. In fact, in the United States Constitution, this is how the Commerce Clause actually works. States have the ability to determine their own policies, except when it builds a wall around the state and keeps out the goods and services from other states. You're not allowed to discriminate against other states and levy a differential tax on them. That's the Commerce Clause. That's the idea I have for these communities. Low walls around them, but engaging people, bringing in the social side, and helping people work with the new capitalism. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. So you see what I mean? Covers a lot of ground, right? So nicely done. Congratulations on the book. Let me just throw a few questions your way before we open it out. So you had the phrase, which I can't remember whether it was in the book or not, but tolerable capitalism, which I thought was a nice way of putting it. I mean, is it your view, in common with some of the economists who have been worrying on the left about rising inequality, that in a sense capitalism has a tendency towards becoming intolerable? And how did the sort of exemplar of the liberal market economy, the post-war consensus that is breaking down, how did they manage to kind of stop this tendency towards things declining or going to pot, as it were? You've got a microphone next to you.
So I'm not sure I used the term tolerable capitalism, but I'll take it. I think when opportunities become really differentiated, capitalism loses its charm. In the United States, for example, one of the biggest... can you hear me back there? You can hear me, right?
We got big thumbs up from the community here, so there we go. Yeah, there we go. Excellent.
This is working. So in the United States, one of the biggest factors promoting capitalism was not Adam Smith's books. Nobody read The Wealth of Nations. It was Horatio Alger's books, which was about how poor young lads, and they were typically lads, could succeed in the capitalism of the 19th century, right? So to my mind, it's the ability to succeed starting from a relatively sort of underprivileged position, which gives capitalism its greatest attraction. And that makes it tolerable. You can tolerate market volatility, you can tolerate ups and downs if you think you have a chance of succeeding no matter where you start. It's when that promise no longer holds, when we get the hereditary capitalism that we have today, meritocratic, but it's a hereditary meritocracy, that people start sort of signing off and saying, this is not the capitalism I want. And that's when the attraction of promises to equalize outcomes, socialism of one kind or the other, becomes more attractive, because capitalism is not only unequal at the beginning, it's also unequal at the end, and it's really not particularly satisfying for those who start at the bottom. I think we're seeing that today. We're seeing both the populism of the right, the populist nationalism, which offers this imagined community of the nation, as well as populism of the left, which offers the brotherhood of the proletariat for everyone, and says we'll all be happy together ever after. Both are becoming more attractive because capitalism itself is failing in leveling the playing field. Now, what's changed the playing field? I mean, don't we have inequality in capitalism? Don't we have these historically disadvantaged communities? Absolutely. They've always been there. But what's new is that we have a broader set of people who feel significantly disadvantaged. And these were people who had a pretty happy existence earlier, and they have significant political clout, whether they're the Gilets jaunes or the Trump followers, and therefore capitalism is now under significantly more threat because these are the people who have signed off on capitalism.
So the populism of the left, I'll ask about Asia in a minute, but the populism of the left, I mean, the vision that you have in the book of inclusive localism and the power of community seems to me admirable, but do you worry that you're, in a sense, losing this intellectual argument because the energy seems to be for those who are worried about what has gone wrong with markets and capitalism seem to be moving towards a much more statist vision. Elizabeth Warren is now the front runner in the Democratic presidential race. You have Jeremy Corbyn. In a sense, people have looked at the post-financial crisis settlement, and they haven't gone for your answer. They've gone for more government, stronger government, break up the banks, break up the big tech companies. And so they, in a sense, you seem to be arguing against the consensus, as it were.
I think I am. Hopefully I'm trying to offer a different vision. It would be too simple to go along with what's already there. And what's wrong with it is what we've historically found to be wrong with that vision. That vision eventually ends up corrupting both the state as well as the private sector, and eventually it acts as a headwind to growth. These big plans, these mega plans, we've had these mega plans for many, many years, and they've made precious little difference. Pouring more money into the public schools without more local engagement is not going to be particularly helpful, because we've poured a lot of money. We will have better teacher salaries, but we may not get better teachers. And therefore, my worry is that these mega plans that are being proposed once again are repeating the mistakes of the past. And we need to figure out why the United States, which had the best education system in the world till around 1960, has gone down significantly since then in terms of even its basic education. And I would argue that it's not for want of money, it's more for want of engagement. And if we could rectify the engagement, we will probably have a better chance. Money is important, but not the only thing. And more bucket loads of money by taxing the rich may not necessarily improve outcomes for the relatively poor, and that road eventually leads to let's figure out how to equalize incomes as opposed to equalize opportunity.
You mentioned technology a lot in the book, and so to cards on the table, I reviewed the book for the FT and very positively, and I talked in there about what your view would have been on whether we should break up the big tech companies. And although I read it quite carefully, you gave a very nuanced account, but I couldn't quite nail you down on whether you thought that companies like Amazon, Facebook, and Google were too big. There's sort of the logic of your argument seems to me to take you in that direction. And you mentioned the issue with Amazon in New York. But do you think these companies should be broken up?
The answer is probably not, but we can do something else to make them much more competitive rather than monopolistic. And I think what we need to do is be much more clever about antitrust than we were in the past. One of the problems today with these companies is basically, given their position and given the network externalities they have, it's very hard for a competitor to rise. And they often buy up the competitor before the competitor can prove a significant threat. So many companies are essentially, if they do enter the space to innovate, are innovating in order to be bought up. And that strengthens the monopoly of these entities. I would say we need to improve access of competitors to the larger marketplace. And one of the things a couple of things that would do that, one, interoperability of the network. Can I, with a Facebook lookalike, have access to the entire Facebook network? We certainly allow that for mobile companies. We say your network has to be interoperable. Therefore, the big network cannot keep out the small network from accessing people. We should do the same thing for these platforms. Interoperability, I think, would help tremendously. And second is data. Of course, part of their value comes from knowing the preferences of each of their customers, which is why they can command a high premium from their advertisers. That data, to the extent possible, should be more owned by people whose data it is, rather than by the companies. That will allow some of the upstarts to buy the data that they need and essentially operate much more effectively. Now, neither of these is in place, and the tech companies will say how impossible these things are, but a determined regulator can push for both these. I think they will even the playing field much more. Why don't I say let's break them up? Well, one of the advantages of this kind of structure is precisely network externalities. Your Facebook page can, you have access to so many of your friends and neighbors. If each region had, for example, a separate network, you would not be able to communicate as well. And so somewhere along the line, we will need interoperability. But if interoperability you're going to anyway enforce after you break up, why not enforce before you break up? That may deal with much of the problem that these platforms create. There are other forms of monopolization that are present. We need clever regulation, but breaking them up is a sledgehammer. And I think we should use it only if all other remedies fail, because these are, after all, also very highly efficient companies. And we don't want the public to lose the benefit of that efficiency. Let's keep innovation going. Let's keep competition going. That means focus on clever regulation rather than ham-fisted sledgehammer regulation.
What about supranational regulation? So in the book, you're quite critical of the European Union, but I mean, in a sense, the argument for things like European Union competition policy is when you have very large global companies, you need global regulation. Your example of the banking system, where it's no good having capital requirements set locally if you have global banks. So what would inclusive localism mean for that? I mean, it seems to me that the kind of logic of your argument is actually we really need a bit less globalization, and we'd probably be happier with fewer large global systems in finance and technology and more local control. But is it possible to have one without the other?
Well, as I said again, where we need international regulation because nothing else works, I'm not against that. But I'm against places where local regulation would work reasonably well. We internationalize things. That leaves people without a sense of control. And that's a bad thing in democracies and creates the kind of reaction that you sometimes see. That said, I think there are virtues to international competition. And one of the problems with international regulation, it fits a uniform one-size-fits-all, sometimes governed not by a sense of what is good for the globe, but governed by the most powerful players there, and often by the most powerful companies within those most powerful players. So, for example, the uniformity of regulation across the globe on intellectual property stems from the greater power of the most significant nation in creating intellectual property, that is the United States. But within the United States, it's the pharma companies, some argue even one pharma company, which essentially pushed for the kind of patent laws we have across the world. That's not democracy. It's not even particularly good policy, because some countries may benefit from much shorter patent protection than we have, and we need to allow 1,000 flowers to bloom. Eventually, we'll figure out what makes more sense. But competition between jurisdictions, I think, shouldn't be underestimated as valuable in enhancing global well-being and growth.
So I want to ask one more question before we open it up. So we're sitting in Singapore, but obviously for predominantly an audience that is interested in South Asia. So in the middle of the book, you have a chapter where you talk about India and China within the framework that you talk about, state, market, and you suggest that, in a sense, the two rising powers of Asia are out of balance, but in different ways, given the ideal framework that you're positing. So could you sort of talk us through that and maybe talk about both India and China and their own challenges in the framework that you set up?
Well, I think it's fairly clear that if you compare the two countries today, China has done far better, starting from relatively similar points in the 1960s than India. China is about 5 times India's size, and because 5 times India's per capita GDP, and because it's got about the same population, is 5 times India's size. And how did these two countries diverge so much, right? And has China won any sort of notional competition between the two countries? And I would argue that what is different between those two countries fundamentally is the Chinese state has significantly more power and significantly less constrained by democratic forces. And that has been very valuable in the early stages of industrialization. In catch-up growth, this kind of structure is very, very beneficial because, I mean, take the simplest thing, construction. A lot of growth comes from construction, building those highways, ports, railways, etc. A big part of that is land acquisition. If you don't have to really worry about democratic reaction, you can acquire land much more easily, and you can build out that infrastructure. It doesn't take rocket science to build that infrastructure. It does take a lot of government capability to acquire the land. And that's where India is stuck, far behind China. You just have to compare the infrastructure across the two countries, and you realize there's a big difference there. And it's a big source of jobs, but it's also a big source of the manufacturing leap that China made. Easy infrastructure, easy access to utilities, cheap factory space, etc., will give you much more in terms of capabilities than India has. Let us also not diminish the fact that the Chinese had far better education than India and have kept that lead still. Now, that's a second factor, but that's more from the communist system, which sort of pushed equal education, and the Chinese did reasonably well, apart from the brief Cultural Revolution spell. What has India going for it? And I would argue what India has going for it is democracy, as well as a private sector. I mean, the two are related. A private sector which has a little more space than historically the Chinese private sector has had. But if the private sector got stronger in India and more independent from the government, it could serve as a better check and balance. Today, I think the comparisons between India and China on the nature of the government, the Indian government can also become more authoritarian. It still is not quite as authoritarian as the Chinese government, but given the weak private sector in India, the Indian state could also become authoritarian. We still have a democratic ethos which frowns on that, but that is a possibility we should always be aware of. What I would hope is that India has a much harder time getting to middle income because that catch-up growth is harder, given it cannot acquire land that easily, given it cannot push construction, given it cannot do things by fiat as the Chinese government can, and it has a less capable government than the Chinese government for sure. But I think the tables may reverse once you get to middle income, because as you go beyond middle income, then it's things like innovation, creativity, dialogue, debate, which become much more important. And there, India's already made the transition to the democratic and social structures that are needed to enhance that. China still has to do it. And in fact, China is moving a little further away from that at this point. Now, China may surprise. It may be the only country to become rich even while being a single-party authoritarian structure. However, if you believe the model in my book, that the probability on that is relatively low. So I believe that China at some point will have to reverse its course and move back on the course it was on in the early part of the century. More democratization, more powers to people, and that will make it, in fact, a lot better engaged with the global economy, with the democratic side of the global economy, not seem so foreign to the rest of the world. India, if it reaches middle income, can grow faster from middle income than it has been growing so far. But it has to reach middle income yet. And that's the big challenge for India. How do we liberalize the economy to achieve that growth, which we find so hard today? Democracy, Lee Kuan Yew said democracy is a little bit of a burden for India. I wouldn't put it so strongly. There are benefits, intrinsic benefits to democracy also. It also makes for a more equitable path, but we need to make sure it doesn't slow our growth too much, and therefore we need to manage better and manage while being democratic. And that is India's challenge over the next few years, how to get to middle income while being democratic and then take off. I think that takeoff will be easier, but let's get to middle income first.
Very good. So over to you. From optimism about India to which Taylor Swift song he likes most. The floor is yours. I saw a question at the front. Do we have a roving microphone? Maybe you could. I'll take a couple of questions and introduce yourself. There we go.
My name is Iftikhar Chowdhury. ISAS, originally from Bangladesh. Professor, I enjoyed your lecture very much, let me say at the outset, and your book, of course, is a must-read for all of us now. The point that I was wondering about is, in your analysis, obviously you're talking of layers of community. Now, in your view, at what equilibrium, at what optimal equilibrium should sovereignty lie in the layers that you have described? You mentioned Switzerland, for instance. So now in Switzerland, in your view, is it more optimal would it have been more optimal for sovereignty to reside in the village commune level, from where, of course, the community word is derived, or at the canton level, or at the level of the federation, which is Switzerland, or even at the level of Switzerland and Liechtenstein, the sort of broad confederation? Or is the concept, or the classical concept of sovereignty becoming an impediment to the realization of societal aspirations? Thank you.
Very good. Why don't you take that one, and then I'll take a question from the back. Yeah.
Okay. Look, I am going to take the concept of sovereignty as the powers that a nation exercises. And I would say today, the single most important political structure still, in many people's eyes, is the nation state. When you look across people of different income groups, the relatively well-to-do, are happy with community, state, nation, all kinds of structures. The relatively poorly to-do are much more engaged with the nation than with the locality. And that's why they've, easy fodder for the nationalists, because that's the structure that they identify most with. So nation state has captured our imagination. And I would argue a disempowered nation state creates problems. So you need powers at that level. However, I also think that too much of an identification with the nation, too little with local, tends to then create a dangerous situation where the nation becomes the vehicle for all your ambitions. Nations have armies, and those armies then are put into action. So too much of an identification with the nation and its powers and its respect and prestige creates the kind of jingoism which eventually doesn't turn out well. So I would want rather that more powers be exercised locally, only a few at the national level, but more of a sense of identity be built around the community.
Right. I see a hand right at the back. I want to be fair to the community and not just go to the privileged at the front. So sir, in the white shirt, I saw your hand. Keep the questions reasonably brief, if you would, and they should have a question mark at the end of them. But introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks very much, Dr. Rajan. My name is Abhinav, and I currently work here at the Milken Institute in Singapore, originally from the U.S. So I want to ask you, recently, if you look at the U.S. elections, especially the Democratic debates, we've seen the focus shift to, talking points such as the rise of AI, technology, and universal basic income, UBI. So I want to ask you, do you think UBI has the potential to bring back or create this resurgence in the community in countries such as the US and maybe even India?
Should I? Okay. Look, let me first throw out a question. When do you think UBI was first discussed? I mean, this is a trick question, of course. Presumably it's been discussed all through history, but the earliest reference I could find was a commission under President Johnson in the United States in the 1960s, which looked at the threat of growing automation and how nobody would have jobs as robots came and replaced everybody, and therefore proposed universal basic income. That's, what, now 60 years ago? And we still don't have, we still have unemployment relatively low. You may worry about the nature of jobs, but I fear that, I still think UBI is premature. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have, earned income tax credits for the relatively poor, etc. But I think it's too early to pension off a bunch of people and say, there is no place for you in the workforce, enjoy your income and sit outside. So put differently, I don't argue against supplements to incomes when you have low incomes. That's the earned income tax credit. I do argue against completely telling people, okay, there's no hope for you to get a job, why don't you spend your days with this very modest income, but enough to keep body and soul together, and for the rest of life we'll pay for you. That seems to me defeatist. And it seems to me a recipe for trouble, because not only do people, who just get incomes and have no work, often lose a sense of self-worth, but it becomes areas of crime and various kinds of abuse. So I would say it's too early. At some point in the not so distant future, maybe we all will feel it's better to go to the beachside and loll on the beach and have robots doing work for us. That would be a good time, but I think it's far away. I mean, take anybody in this room. I think most people in this room have enough money to retire. And, get a modest UBI. Would anybody want to do it? And my guess is nobody in this room would take that offer up. Not just because their consumption needs have grown and that modest UBI is not enough, but just because there's so much value in work. There's so much sense of self-worth. So I think it's too early. There may come a day, and there are some costs associated with UBI in the sense of putting a lot of people beyond the reach of the workforce, and it's very hard to bring them back. And even if there are good jobs that emerge in the future, getting these people back in the workforce will be very, very hard. So I would say, let's bring UBI when we're convinced there's no jobs at all, and let's see the evidence for that, because the President's Commission under Lyndon Johnson thought that was just a few years away, just like everybody thinks today.
Let's take a couple more questions. Okay, so we'll have one at the front. And then I see there's another gentleman at the back in the blue shirt. So go ahead.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your talk. I'm thinking of my name is Nupur, and I'm from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I'm thinking of what you said from a more micro perspective. So in India, we see a large-scale movement of people from the villages, like thousands are moving to the cities. And currently, we do identify villages as the major centers of local power. Also, we have a government which is focusing more on centralization and is pushing for centralization of power. In such a scenario, how do you see what you propose as a solution panning out in India? Because do you see this as something that comes from a top-down approach? Like, does the state decide and give the power to the people? Which I don't see it happening in the current government system. Or do you see education as a major solution for this, where you actually show the advantages of local power to the people and then they claim back the power?
Very good. Let me just take one more. There's a gentleman at the back.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Rajan, for your interesting speech. So the question that I have is, RCEP's results are just around the corner, and I am Dilip Krishnan. I work for a local financial institution here. So with RCEP coming forward, will that further increase the divide with leaving the community behind, or will that help us in including the community as well? So that's the question that I have.
Okay, so what does urbanization in Asia mean for inclusive localism, and what about new trade deals?
Yeah. Look, I mean, Gandhi's vision of India was self-governing local villages, right? And Gandhi was a very perceptive man. He had deep insight, and he worried about the brutalization that happened when you had an anonymous government determining policies far away, as well as an anonymous market. And I think he was absolutely right that the community offers a personalization that is an antidote to the anonymization. You need all three, which is why I say three pillars, but you need the personalization. You need people to have a sense of both belonging, but also with that belonging comes a sense of support. What we're seeing in many villages is what Banfield called a moral familiarism. That is, people are just losing interest in what's going on because there's very little power at the village level. And the Sarpanch after Panchayati Raj has a little more power, but still not the kind of active, engaged population that would be. Now, this is chicken and egg. Most people point to this and say, how do you expect these guys to take any interest? Well, they don't take any interest because there's nothing to take interest in. And if you decentralize more, I mean, take, for example, decentralizing to the municipalities. Many of our cities are run very poorly because the municipality has very little power. Much of it lies with the state government, and they extract the revenues from the cities but don't push back revenues to make the city better. So I think decentralization in India, constitutional decentralization would be a good thing. And I think you're absolutely right. Every party has been guilty of holding on to power. The center today actually wants to reverse the process by taking back some of the funding that has gone to the states, taking back some of the powers. And similarly, the states have never respected Panchayati Raj and pushed power down to the communities, to the villages and the municipalities. They've held the funding at the state level. Every finance commission has said more decentralization, more decentralized. We started post-independence much more centralized because we needed national unity. We are beyond that. We have national unity. Now let's focus on generating national creativity. And that means pushing power down. I don't have an answer to this is a centralizing government. I think they already have to be aware of the costs of centralization. Too much power has moved to the center. Not just the constitutional centralization, even the de facto centralization. Too many ministers who don't have the authority to do what they need to do because too much power resides at the core. That's an issue in every situation that you see in India today. And certainly, it may be that they themselves recognize the harm in this and move. On RCEP, it's a trade agreement, and I don't know how it will eventually pan out. But I think one of India's big issues is how to become part of both the regional as well as international supply chains. And unless we bring down the level of tariffs, I think it's very hard. Now, we do have duty drawbacks and this and that, which compensate for tariffs which go back on exports. But you still have tariffs if the entity wants to produce for the domestic market. And that prevents people from learning from domestic production. And so I think a low tariff environment is really necessary if India wants to engage more globally. Now, we have to be, if you want to negotiate tariffs, be clever about it, but being part of the structure is really necessary to create the jobs we need in order to spread economic activity.
Very good. Okay, let's take a couple more final questions. So I see one here, one at the front, and one there. Let's take three more, and then we'll wrap up. So can we? I saw one here. Oh, we've got confusion. Okay, all right. The might is right. So go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for your interesting talk. I have a question. Since you mentioned about the influence of technology in the current system, now should we still stick to the performance and productivity measuring tools of first industrial revolution or should we have a different method or tools to engage, to measure productivity and profitability because taking into account of these technological revolutions?
Very good. And over here in the blue shirt.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Rajan. My name's Aditya. I'm a student at Yale and US College, originally from India. My question for you is the implications for your model, especially your solution to move more power to communities for monetary policy, stemming from your experience in central banking. Would moving more sort of power to communities detrimentally impacts central banking policies, especially in a time when monetary policy doesn't seem to be as effective? Or really would it improve the ability for central banks to sort of stimulate growth?
Okay, and one final question over here, and then we're going to wrap up. Sorry for those of you who tried to catch my eye. I'm afraid we need to let Dr. Rajan go. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Crabtree. My name is Ashish, and sir, it's indeed an honor to listen to you. I'm a student of public policy at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and I'm come from India. And I run a youth organization called MASH Foundation, where we work with young leaders and empowering them to impact their communities. So I think the topic is so relevant to the kind of work we do. So I have a quick two questions. First of all, where do you see the role of young people in the whole process, where it's from more to state or markets rather than how do we empower these community leaders to work in taking stands? So where do you see the role of these young leaders, and especially for a country like India, where we are a very youth dominated country, and some of these things will be hugely impacting. And second question is that how do you see this new finance, like social financing and different tools like impact bonds and impact investments actually trickling down and empowering these communities to be becoming more and more effective? So because my question is coming because we hear a lot about these things, but then what are the big factors which will be playing in terms of impacting these areas? Yeah.
Very good. Excellent questions to end. Now you can wrap all of this up magisterially.
Great. Magisterially. Thank you. Measuring productivity and profitability. Unfortunately, the answer is the traditional economist answer: it depends. It depends on what particular activity you have in mind. I mean, if it's peace production, we measure that pretty well, and I wouldn't change that. But if you're thinking about, for example, the bads that production does, the environmental impact, the emissions and things like that, well, yes, those are things we don't measure particularly well, and we need to add that to how we measure productivity, and so more work certainly needs to be done there. On the implications for monetary policy, I think the point I'm trying to make is these central policies have only limited effect when, in fact, the deep problem is one of underdevelopment, local underdevelopment. If, for example, you have a neighborhood which is afflicted by crime, lower interest rates aren't going to impel any business to invest there because the costs of investing are really too high. You first need to bring down crime, then lower interest rates can help. So monetary policy is ineffective in this local development, but with some aids, some changes, can be very effective. So how do you make more areas receptive to monetary influences? And that means make it much more amenable to things like investment. That means deal with the crime, deal with the drugs, deal with other issues that impede investment. The role of young people, I think young people are our future. That's obvious. They're also, very energetic. The problem in many places is young people have left. How do we bring them back? How do we give them an incentive to build locally rather than leave? And for that, it's worth thinking about clever ways of bringing them back. For example, could student debts be forgiven for young people who spend more time back in a depressed community? No matter what they do, just being around can be a beneficial thing. Similarly, could we reduce taxes for those who stay in a depressed community? Now, with modern technology, you can basically determine where people spend most of their time. So given that, are there ways that we can have more congestion pricing of taxes? If you stay in a big city, well, you're not contributing that much socially relative to what's already there. If you stay in a poor community, you are. So is it worth exploring some kind of tax? Because one of the things that Singapore does is it forces integration. Now, most other countries, you can't force that integration. But can we incentivize integration by appropriate mild changes in the tax code? That's worth thinking about. Get more people to come back, not leave the community. And finally, impact investing bonds. I mean, I think enhancing the financing possibilities is today much more possible because values in the broader country have changed. More people think this is a good thing and are willing to accept slightly lower returns for socially beneficial products. So in that sense, there is an opportunity here. Many communities benefit from philanthropic funds, and there's a lot more philanthropic funds now being made available. So I would say, by all means, let's use every instrument we have, and let's engage people, including the very rich, in helping out. And to my mind, that's a better way of engaging the rich than to demonize them and say, you've made money at all our expenses, which is true only in a few cases, not in every case. Instead, let's engage them by saying, okay, you've got a lot of money, you don't know what to do with it, why don't you be happier by giving it back in creative ways?
Very good. So the book is the third pillar, How Markets and the State Leave the Community Behind. It's available at all good airports, but you get extra points if you buy it from your local community bookstore. Please give Dr. Rajan a big round of applause to say thank you for coming to talk to us here today.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan and Mr. Crabtree. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this ISAS lecture. Before we adjourn for tea break, here's a gentle reminder to register for the 4th SADC at the reception desk outside to enjoy an exclusive 30% discount off the registration fee. For just 200 Singapore dollars, you enjoy the SADC Gala Dinner at Shangri-La Hotel and to a full-day convention proceedings the following day at the University Cultural Centre. With that, I invite you to the tea reception outside. Thank you, and we look forward to your continued support for ISAS events. See you at SADC 2019.
Thank you.